I call Chris Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I just want to respond to the charge from Dr Clark, who just spoke, that this is a cynical government. The only thing cynical around offshore buyers that has happened in this parliament and in this society in the last 3 months was the cynical, cheap, crass and outrageous attack on Chinese migrants by the Labour Party.
That's right.
So if that meets the very definition of cynical, exploiting and demonising an ethnic minority for cheap and craven political purposes. So this is not a cynical piece of legislation. This is a well-intentioned and well-meaning attempt, sir, to obtain tax information from people buying and selling property in New Zealand by amending the Land Transfer Act 1952 and the Tax Administration Act 1994 to improve the enforcement of non-residents' tax obligations. And the key change, sir, that the bill provides is to require buyers and sellers of property to provide an IRD number or the equivalent tax number in the case of residents of other countries. And, sir, individuals buying or selling a main home are exempt from that requirement. And, sir, just in my brief contribution to the House, I just want to canvass that exemption that is in the piece of legislation we're considering, and came for some robust debate at the Select Committee process, as has been adverted to by Mr Robinson a few moments ago. And there was some suggestion from members opposite and some suggestion from others at the committee that we should include all property transactions within the scope of this bill. So, in other words, all property transactions in New Zealand, whether or not they included a main home or whether or not they didn't include a main home, all buyers and sellers of property would be required to provide their IRD number. Why did the government decide not to do this, sir? Well, the first reason, and the most fundamental reason, is that the proposed bright line test, which, as members will know, is contained in the legislation that we will consider in a few moments' time, the proposed bright line test, the companion piece of legislation to this bill, sir, exempts the main home from that legislation. So there's little point in requiring everyone who buys and sells a property in New Zealand, everyone who buys and sells a main home or buys and sells a property with the intention of living in it as their main home, there's little point in requiring everybody to supply their IRD number when they are going to be exempt from the bright line test, which is the major point of the legislation that we're about to consider, sir. So that's the most fundamental reason. The supplementary reasons, sir, which relate to the main reason, are that it would greatly increase the volume of information that people would have to provide to LINZ, Land Information New Zealand, and the IRD, sir. And we believe also, on this side of the House, that it would make people, we believe, worry needlessly about whether or not a transaction was taxable. Now, in the vast majority of cases when people buy and sell a main home, a place that they're living in, a place that they have a great connection to, but in the vast majority of cases, those transactions are not going to be taxable, sir. But the requirement for people to supply an IRD number needlessly, sir, will make people worry about whether or not that transaction is taxable or not. And so, sir, that is why we are not. That is why we are exempting the main home from this legislation. Grant Robertson said, well, the officials advised against it. Now that is, I have to say, sir, a little bit rich, because governments are entitled to listen to what officials have to say, and they are entitled to take a different course. In fact, the previous Labor government made a virtue of ignoring Treasury advice year after year, ignoring the official advice from the Treasury and the IRD about a whole range of matters. In fact, they made a virtue of it. Michael Cullen used to turn up in this House and talk at length about how Treasury had an ideological burp and other such matters. So, you know, yes, governments are entitled to listen to the official advice, but that's actually why governments and parliamentarians are elected, to weigh up the competing advice, to weigh up what officials have to say, and actually to apply their minds as to whether or not a piece of legislation is a good idea or not. So officials are entitled to have their say, but actually officials don't run the country. We do not have a government of the bureaucracy in this country. We have a parliament that makes laws, and we have a government that is made up of lawmakers elected by the people who are responsible to parliament. And so the official advice in this circumstance here has been listened to, but the government has decided to take another path. So this is not a cynical piece of legislation. This is a good bill. members are politicking over the other side, as they are wont to do with pieces of legislation around non-resident buyers, as they are wont to do with migration and the role of non-residents generally in the society. It's regrettable that the Labour Party and Mr Twyford have such little regard for migrants to this country and for foreigners, sir, but sadly that is the way it is. But, sir, I commend this bill to the House.